sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so today we're diving into some pretty murky waters. We're talking about South Africa's land reform policies.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation.
It is, we've got international politics, family drama, and a whole lot of history all mixed up in this one. We've got a recent phone call between Elon Musk and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa to unpack, plus how a certain former U.S. president's tweet really threw gasoline on an already fiery situation.
It's a fascinating case study for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And to guide us through this mess, we've got a couple of key sources. First, we'll be looking at a Reuters article detailing the events.
And we'll also be drawing on an interview with Elon Musk's father, Errol Musk, which adds some interesting, well, some might even say controversial perspectives.
Yeah, a little bit of family drama always spices things up, right?
Always.
Okay, so to set the scene, South Africa has been working to address these huge disparities in land ownership. It's a direct result of their apartheid past, of course. They passed a land reform bill. And, well, that's where things get interesting.
Right, because the goal of this bill is to try and rectify a very deep-rooted imbalance.
Exactly. To give you a sense of the issue, white landowners make up only 8% of the population. But they hold a whopping 75% of the freehold farmland.
That's right. And on the flip side, black landowners who make up 80% of the population only hold 4%.
It's a stark contrast, and this bill aims to change that. But then enter former U.S. President Donald Trump. He posts on social media accusing South Africa of confiscating land, and he even threatens to cut funding to the country.
Now, that might sound like just another tweet, but it actually had pretty significant consequences.
Oh, yeah, I know you're thinking a tweet,
Yeah.
really. But seriously, the South African currency, the rand, took a nearly 2% nosedive after that tweet, and the cost of insuring their debt skyrocketed.
It's a stark reminder that even seemingly off-the-cuff remarks from someone like a former U.S. president can have real economic repercussions.
Yeah, in this case, global markets reacted almost instantly to Trump's words.
And just to be precise, the U.S. funding to South Africa in 2023 was $440 million, with $315 million of that going to HIV/AIDS programs.
So yeah, big money at stake. So Trump throws this grenade, and then Elon Musk, who remember was born in South Africa, jumps into the fray on social media. He accuses South Africa of having openly racist ownership laws, echoing Trump's sentiments.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the potential influence Musk might have had on Trump's thinking.
For sure, they definitely seem to be aligned on this issue. And this brings us to that phone call between Ramaphosa and Musk.
Which came about in a rather unconventional way.
Unconventional is putting it mildly. It turns out the call was arranged through Elon's father, Errol Musk.
Yes, Ramaphosa's advisor actually reached out to Errol to facilitate the conversation.
It's definitely not your usual diplomatic playbook.
Not at all. And Errol didn't just set up the call. He had some strong opinions of his own, too.
Oh, yeah. He was very vocal in his support for Trump's stance. He even suggested that Elon might have played a role in shaping Trump's decision to threaten those funding cuts.
He went as far as to show reporters WhatsApp messages as proof of his involvement.
So we've got international politics, social media, firestorms, family connections. It's like a real-life political thriller. But before we get too deep into Errol's commentary, let's take a step back. Let's make sure we're all on the same page about this land reform bill that's at the heart of it all.
Good point. It's important to understand the nuts and bolts of this bill.
Right. So it allows the state to expropriate land in the public interest. And in some cases, that can mean without compensation.
But it's important to note this doesn't involve the government just taking land willy-nilly. There's a specific legal process laid out for that.
So it's not the land grab some have made it out to be. The intention is to address the historical injustices caused by apartheid, not to punish current landowners.
Exactly. But it's understandable why this issue sparks heated debate.
Both within South Africa and internationally.
Definitely strong feelings on all sides.
And of course, Elon Musk's connection to South Africa adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
Absolutely. He wasn't just commenting on some abstract policy. This is deeply personal for him.
And his involvement alongside Trump's has brought international attention to this issue in a way we haven't seen before. Okay, so we've laid out the situation, but now I'm dying to know what Errol Musk had to say about all this. He seems like quite a character.
Oh, he definitely is, and his perspective adds a whole new dimension to this story. But before we delve into that, let's make sure we understand a bit more about Errol himself.
Good idea. What's his background? What are his potential biases?
Right, we need that context to interpret his statements more critically.
So you mentioned he's 78 years old and an engineer.
Yes, that's right.
What else do we know about him?
Well, the article mentions that he lives in a wealthy coastal town in South Africa, and he works in property development. He's also involved with Starlink, Elon's satellite company.
Ah, so he's not just your average dad offering casual opinions.
Not at all. This is someone who's accustomed to dealing with complex business and technology issues.
Right. His background definitely shapes his views on this. Okay, so now that we have a better sense of who Errol is, let's finally hear what he had to say. I'm ready for the juicy bits. What were his most striking statements?
Well, one that really raised eyebrows was his questioning of why American taxpayers should be funding HIV/AIDS treatment in South Africa.
Whoa, that's a really loaded statement, especially considering the devastating impact of the epidemic on South Africa. It sounds like this conversation is about to take a very interesting turn.
That's a bold statement, isn't it? I mean, the HIV/AIDS crisis in South Africa is incredibly complex.
It really is.
It's not just a public health issue. It's intertwined with socioeconomic factors, access to healthcare, and even cultural stigmas.
Right.
And Errol's comment kind of taps into this broader debate about foreign aid.
Exactly. Its effectiveness, the responsibilities of developed nations. Should countries like the U.S. be providing financial assistance to combat HIV/AIDS in other parts of the world?
And if so, how much and under what conditions?
Tough questions. Yeah, no easy answers there. It's a reminder that sometimes the most personal stories are also playing out on this global stage. And speaking of personal, Errol also offered his interpretation of the phone call between his son and President Ramaphosa. Now, we don't know exactly what was said, but Errol had some thoughts.
Oh, he did.
He did. He suggested that Elon likely cautioned Ramaphosa against what he perceived as a war on white people. He even drew a comparison to Zimbabwe's land seizures under Mugabe.
Which, as you may know, led to significant economic instability and hardship.
Exactly. A lot of people point to Zimbabwe as an example of what can go wrong with land reform.
It's a pretty heavy parallel to draw. So essentially, he's suggesting that Elon delivered this stern warning about the potential consequences of South Africa's land reform policies.
That's how I interpret it, yes.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that this is just Errol's speculation. We don't have access to the actual conversation.
Right. We don't want to present his interpretation as fact.
Okay, so it's just one perspective, and it's definitely a provocative one. So let's bring this back to the land reform bill itself. We've heard some strong opinions about it, both for and against. But what are the core arguments on each side?
Well, those who support the bill see it as an essential step towards addressing the lasting legacy of apartheid.
They'd say it's not just about righting past wrongs, but about building a more stable and just future for South Africa.
Precisely, they argue that the extreme disparity in land ownership, with a small white minority controlling most of the land decades after apartheid ended, is simply unsustainable.
They'd say it breeds resentment and instability.
Exactly. And they view the bill as a way to create a more equitable society.
On the other hand, critics of the bill, while acknowledging the historical injustices, they worry about the potential economic repercussions.
Right. They argue that expropriating land without compensation, even if done through legal processes, could deter investment, harm agricultural production, and ultimately damage the South African economy.
So it's a classic dilemma, isn't it? Trying to balance the demands of social justice with the need for economic stability.
It is, and I imagine there are also concerns about setting a precedent that could undermine property rights more broadly.
For sure, it's a very complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
And it's important to note that even within South Africa, there's no single unified stance on this.
Public opinion is divided.
Absolutely. And there's ongoing debate about how to best address this complex historical legacy.
It makes you wonder if there's any way to achieve meaningful land reform without triggering these potential economic downsides. Are there examples from other countries that have gone through similar processes that South Africa could learn from?
That's a great question. And yes, there are definitely historical parallels that we can look at. For example, Zimbabwe, which Errol Musk referenced, is often cited as a cautionary tale.
Right.
The land seizures there, while initially aimed at redressing colonial imbalances, were ultimately poorly managed. And they contributed to economic collapse and social unrest.
That's a sobering thought. So are there any examples of countries that have managed to implement successful land reform programs without causing major economic disruption?
There are, for instance, South Korea's land reform in the mid-20th century. Though undertaken in a very different context, is often pointed to as a model of successful redistribution. It led to greater economic equality and rural development.
So it's not an impossible task.
Not at all, but it requires careful planning, sensitivity to the various stakeholders involved, and a commitment to long-term stability.
And it also highlights the importance of learning from both the successes and failures of other nations that have grappled with similar challenges.
Absolutely. Studying history can provide valuable insights for present-day policy decisions.
It's all about understanding those historical patterns and applying them to contemporary challenges.
Exactly. That's the beauty of historical analysis. It allows us to see beyond the immediate headlines and recognize the broader trends and forces at play.
And in this case, it helps us understand why the land reform debate in South Africa is so charged and why the stakes are so high.
For sure.
We've covered a lot of ground here. We started with a tweet, delved into land reform and its global implications, and even got a glimpse into this fascinating family dynamic. But it feels like we've only scratched the surface of a much larger story.
We have, and it's a story that's still unfolding. The phone call between Ramaphosa and Musk was just one chapter, and it remains to be seen what impact, if any, it will have on South Africa's policies.
Right. Will Trump follow through on his threat to cut funding? How will the international community respond?
These are all questions that will continue to be debated and analyzed.
It's a story that highlights the interconnectedness of global politics, economics, and even personal relationships. And it underscores the fact that seemingly isolated events can have ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate context.
And it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power privilege and the legacies of colonialism that continue to shape our world today.
We've been talking about the potential economic consequences of land reform, but what about the social and political implications? And how might this bill reshape the social fabric of South Africa?
That's a crucial aspect of this story. Supporters of the bill argue that it's not just about land, it's about dignity empowerment and creating a more inclusive society.
And critics might argue that it could further divide the country along racial lines, potentially exacerbating existing tensions.
That's a valid concern, and it's one that South African leaders will need to navigate very carefully.
It sounds like the real challenge lies in finding a way to balance the need for redress with the desire for unity and stability.
It does. It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
It is.
And it's a challenge that goes beyond South Africa. Many countries around the world are grappling with similar issues: historical injustice, inequality, and the need for social transformation.
It makes you realize that this story is about so much more than just a phone call or a piece of legislation. It's a microcosm of the broader struggles for justice and equality that are playing out on a global scale.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the personal is always political, and that even seemingly local issues can have far-reaching consequences. And it compels us to think critically about our own roles and responsibilities in addressing these complex challenges.
It's been an incredibly insightful deep dive so far. We've examined the events, the arguments, and even the personalities involved. But I think it's time we step back and consider the bigger picture. What does all of this mean for the average person listening in?
That's a great question.
What are the key takeaways they should be pondering?
That's a question we'll explore further when we return. But for now, let's pause here and allow our listener to absorb everything we've discussed. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's important to give them time to process the information and formulate their own thoughts.
All right, so we've gone pretty deep into the specifics of this situation in South Africa. But what does it all mean for the rest of us? Why should someone listening in who might not have any direct connection to South Africa care about this?
Yeah, that's a really important question to consider, because this isn't just about one country or one piece of legislation. This deep dive has uncovered these universal themes that resonate far beyond South Africa's borders.
Right, I'm thinking about the legacy of colonialism, the struggle for equality and economic justice, the influence of social media on global events.
Exactly, and the ethical considerations surrounding foreign aid, the responsibilities of developed nations, that tricky balance between offering help and potentially exerting undue influence.
We've also seen how personal connections and even family dynamics can play a surprising role in shaping international affairs.
Yeah.
I mean, who would have thought Elon Musk's dad would be involved in diplomatic backchannels?
Right. It really highlights how interconnected our world is, how these seemingly separate spheres can collide in unexpected ways.
So it's not just about staying informed, it's about understanding the forces that shape our world, the historical patterns that repeat themselves, and the choices we face as individuals and as a global community.
You got it. And this specific deep dive, with its intricate web of politics, economics, and social justice, provides a perfect lens for examining these bigger questions.
It's like a case study in how the past continues to shape the present, how individual actions can have global consequences, and how even seemingly intractable problems can be tackled, though not without difficulty.
Right, and for someone listening in, it might spark some introspection. What are their own biases? How do they view their country's role on the global stage? What are their own personal responsibilities when it comes to issues of justice and equality?
So before we wrap things up, is there a final thought-provoking question we can leave our listener with? Something that builds on everything we've discussed, but pushes them to think even further?
Absolutely. Given the historical context and the current global landscape, how can we as individuals and as nations advocate for positive change in the world? Without repeating the mistakes of the past, how do we balance the need for intervention with respect for another country's sovereignty and self-determination? It's a question that doesn't have a simple answer, but it's one worth wrestling with.
That's a great point. It's a question that encourages continued exploration, critical thinking, and a deeper understanding of our interconnected world.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe our listener will be inspired to take action, to become part of the solution in their own way.
We can only hope. And I think that's the ultimate goal of these deep dives, to empower our listeners with knowledge, to spark their curiosity, and to encourage them to engage with the world in a more informed and thoughtful way. So thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.